Hello, and I'm back for just a little bit more on Genesis, um, and I'll try to keep this one. This is more of a try to keep this one a little shorter, but I want to talk today about the story of Adam and Eve and the fall. And there's obviously a lot more you could talk about with Genesis, and but we'll, you know, um, try to keep things manageable here. Um, and just sort of focus on this very famous story. You can see here a representation from Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel of the story. And here's Adam and Eve in the garden. Here's the serpent. Here's Adam and Eve being expelled from the garden. And this is Genesis 4. It's on page 83 in our text. Um, sorry, Genesis 3. What am I talking about? This is Genesis 3 on page 82 in our text. Um, and so let's hop on over to here's our Hebrew English facing text again. And of course, you'll remember that the word Lord here in the English corresponds to the word Yahweh. Um, Sometimes incorrectly pronounced Jehovah by going back to ancient Roman times, but it's Yahweh in the name of God, the name of the Canaanite God in the text, in the Hebrew text. So every time you see Lord in your book, just remember Yahweh. And I try to read it as Yahweh, or even when I'm reading my head, to hear Yahweh, because it really changes the nature of how you experience the text. You remember that this is an ancient Near Eastern text. This is an ancient Near Eastern God, and these people have a connection to the larger development of civilization in the ancient Near East. Um, and as I said before, this is the Yahwist part of Genesis. So this is a different author, different story, different fragmentary text than Genesis 1, where you have Elohim, Ruach Elohim, who's speaking things into existence. All right. So God creates Adam out of the dust, all right, shapes him, breathes life into his nostrils. He creates Eve from one of Adam's rib bones. So again, quite a weird supernatural process, of course. He removes Adam's rib and then he uses that rib to create Eve, almost like sort of kind of Jurassic Park-esque thing where he uses part of Adam's body to create a new human being, kind of weird cloning going on. But it is a process that has a sort of physical explanation. It doesn't just, in Genesis 1, just speaks man and woman into existence at the same time. Genesis 2 is where you get the 2 and 3 is where you get that hierarchy of Adam first, Eve second, or man first, woman second. And then there's also the question of like the rules that God sets in place about Eden. Now, Eden is a paradise, right? And by that, I mean, there's no pain, there's no suffering, there is no, you know, backbreaking labor of any kind. It seems like Adam and Eve just sort of go around and they live off the land. The Eden provides this plenty for them. And we're all familiar with the concept of an Eden, right? Where we don't have to worry about anything, basically, right? There's just one rule. God has planted these two trees in the midst of the garden, and says you can eat of any of these trees, but the tree of knowledge of good and evil, you are not allowed to eat from that one. That's the only rule. It's the one rule. And so Genesis 3, 2 and 3, or the story of Adam and Eve, the Yahwist text in of creation, is a story about the origins of all kinds of suffering, right? And the origins of mortality. And we know that this connects back to Gilgamesh, who, of course, was so traumatized by the death of Enkidu and by the thought of his own mortality that he went on this mystical journey to try to find the secret to immortality, right? And Gilgamesh's fear of death, right, or in his sort of contemplation of, well, why should I have to die? That's one of the essential human questions, right? Why do we have to die? And if we have to die, if death is inevitable, like, is life even worth it? Or how do we deal with the fear of it or the anxiety surrounding it? Genesis, the Yahweh's text of Genesis is a text that tries to explain the origins of mortality and also the origins of all kinds of suffering and evil, right? And this will sort of push us forward into a discussion of Job, which is your next reading, right? So we've got this one rule, and don't eat the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and it seems easy enough. They have plenty of other things that they can eat. Everything else in Eden is made to serve them. But this is a story about how we as human beings will know exactly what the right thing to do is and not do it, right? Or know exactly what the wrong thing to do is and do it anyway. And how is it that we could possibly do that? But we do it all the time, right? And so we got the character, but it's also a strange text in that it really leaves so much out that seems to require interpretation or analysis or exegesis or some kind for it to really make sense. All right, here we go. We got the serpent here, right? The snake. Now the serpent was more subtle than any beast of the field which Yahweh God had made. Or in our text, this is on page 83, the serpent was most cunning of all the beasts of the field that Yahweh God had made. Cunning, subtle. Basically what it's saying here is the serpent is crafty, he's tricky, he's clever. He's also not got our best interests at heart. Right away, I have questions, which the text does not answer. And so he starts talking to Eve, and he said unto the woman, yea, hath God said, ye shall not eat of any tree of the garden? Why is the snake talking? How is the snake talking? Is this normal in Eden? Do all the animals talk? Do all the snakes talk? Is it just this one snake? If so, how is it that he's able to talk? Why is he talking? Why is he out to get Eve? Why is he trying to trip them up? And he uses this verbal sophistry to trick Eve, right? Though God had said, you shall not eat from any tree of the garden, right? And Eve corrects him, no, we can eat of any tree of the garden, right? And the woman said unto the serpent, what are you talking about, right? Of course, of the fruit of the tree of the garden we may eat, but of the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, the one that's right in the middle, the tree of knowledge of good and evil, God hath said, ye shall not eat of it, neither shall ye touch it, lest ye die. So Eve knows the rule, and she recites it to the letter, right? Although, hang on, sorry. If you actually look back at the commandment that God gives them, there's only one commandment. God says, from every fruit of the garden you may surely eat, but from the tree of knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for on the day you eat of it you are doomed to die. Right? Eve says, we shall not eat of it, neither shall we touch it, lest ye die. So God never said anything about not touching it. Yahweh never said anything about not touching it. Eve sort of seems to have added that in there. And maybe that's the thing that trips her up. That's what trips her up. in various interpretations and analyses and biblical commentaries going all the way back to ancient times, right? People like Maimonides, that Eve misunderstands the commandment, thinks the commandment is actually stricter than it is, and that's how the serpent is able to trick her, because the serpent is sort of touching the tree. He's there in the tree, and so that's part of what convinces Eve that it's okay. I don't know. That's not in the text, right? That speaks to part of the problem with Genesis 3 is that you just have so many questions, right? Why is the serpent talking? Why is the serpent out to get Eve? Why does Eve do it? How is she so easily convinced? The serpent said unto the woman, Ye shall not surely die, for God doth know that in the day ye eat thereof, then your eyes shall be opened, and ye shall be as God, knowing good and evil. In our text, ye shall not be doomed to die, for God knows that on the day ye eat of it, your eyes will be open, and you will become as gods, knowing good and evil. So pretty much the same translation. God is, you're not gonna die. God just knows that if you eat from that tree, you'll become as smart as him, basically. And that's all it takes. And he's like, oh, okay. And when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was to be a desire to make one wise, she took the fruit thereof and did eat, and she also gave unto her husband with her, and he did eat. And the eyes of both of them were opened, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves girdles. So the first thing that happens after they eat of the fruit is that they had been naked this whole time. They don't have any clothes, and it doesn't bother them. They're not ashamed to be naked because there's nothing sinful about it, and there's no embarrassment or shame in eating. Those feelings don't exist yet until they eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And then all of a sudden, bad things start to make sense to them, and their nakedness is a source of shame, and so they immediately cover up. But note, there again, like, so how could she possibly, how is this enough to convince her? It's not very satisfying. It's not supposed to be. It's not a novel. It's a myth. And myths don't necessarily have to have this sort of psychological realism that we crave in our storytelling. But there are also some key facts that are left out, right? So she gives the fruit to Adam, and he eats it too. Note here, by the way, doesn't say anything about an apple. It is not an apple, despite the fact that we always think of it as an apple, or that it's always pictured as an apple. Doesn't really make sense for it to be an apple, because if you remember where we are, we're in the ancient Near East, and Eden is even described as being along the Euphrates River, right? It has a physical location in Earth, and I don't think they have apples over there, to my knowledge. Apple is like a sort of European fruit. In the rabbinic scholarship, I think it's supposed to be a fig, right? Which makes sense because then they sow the fig leaves, right? Doesn't matter. But anyway, it's not an apple. She gives it to Adam, and he eats it. But there's no explanation of whether she lets him in on the fact that this is that fruit. Just says she gave it to her husband with her, and she did eat. Right? Does he know? Does he not know? Doesn't say. So the sparseness of the myth leaves a lot of room for question and interpretation, and that's going to become very important as we move forward through time, right? We're here we are getting an explanation for the origin of all the evil and suffering in the world, right? And it leaves us with more questions than answers, almost, right? So then they realize they're in trouble, and they heard the voice of Yahweh. This is 8. They heard the voice of Yahweh, God, walking in the garden toward the cool of day. There again is Yahweh walking around in the garden. This is not the Ruach Elohim, the disembodied spirit of Genesis 1. This is one of those ancient Near Eastern things, right? Ishtar, Aruru, and Ninurta, right? They walk around. They have a physical presence and embodiment, just like Yahweh does. He's walking around in the garden, and he's like, where are you guys? I thought God was omniscient. Well, Yahweh doesn't seem to. He's playing. Either he's playing around with them, or he doesn't know where they are. Right. And Yahweh God called unto the man and said unto him, "Where art thou? Where are you?" And Adam says, "Well, I heard your voice in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, and I hid myself." Well, it's like, God walks into the locker room while he's changing, so Adam like sort of dives into his locker. Uh-oh. I gotta erase some of my recordings. Let me. I just got a low storage warning. And God is like, "Who told you you were naked? How do you know you're naked? You're not supposed to know that." And Adam's like, "Well, I mean, we ate of the tree." Wait, hang on a second. Let me move my head here. Who told thee that thou wast naked? Hast thou eaten of the tree whereof I commanded thee not to eat? And did you eat that from that tree? And it's almost like something your parents would say to you, right? Did you eat those cookies, right? Did you get into the candy drawer again? And but surely Yahweh knows this, right? Well, two possibilities, right? Either no, he doesn't know this because he's not an omniscient, supreme being at this point, or he does know it and he's like wants them to confess it themselves. If you just take the plain letter of the text, which is always their safest bet, then he doesn't know. This is not an omniscient God. This is one of those more limited kinds of gods who has gaps in his knowledge. And the man said, "The woman whom thou gavest to be with me, she gave me of the tree, and I did eat." So Adam immediately throws Eve under the bus. And Yahweh said unto the woman, "What is it thou hast done?" And the woman said, "The serpent beguiled me, and I did eat. Oh, it was the serpent's fault. He tricked me." Right? So everybody's blaming everybody else. So God punishes everybody. He punishes the serpent. He punishes Eve. He punishes Adam. If you are familiar with the way this story is infused with all kinds of meaning in later traditions, especially the Christian tradition, you might be of the mistaken belief that the serpent is not just a serpent, but that he's Satan or the devil, right? And that his role here is to bring about the fall of mankind, and that's why he does what he does. But note that Genesis doesn't say anything. There is no Satan, there is no devil in the text of Genesis itself. It's just a snake. And no explanation about why a snake would want to do this or how a snake would be able to do this, right? As I said. This is much more mythic and primal than that. There is no... you're familiar with the idea of like retconning? It's an explanation I sometimes use. I don't know. It's way too nerdy to be helpful for most non-nerds, but in Star Wars, in the movie that came out in 1977, Darth Vader is just a guy, Darth Vader, right? And then later on, they decided, oh, he's actually Anakin Skywalker, Luke's father. It wasn't like that originally. They just went back and decided, oh, well, it's cool. It makes more sense. It adds depth to the story, whatever. We're gonna change things retroactively. Same thing here, right? It's just a snake. But later on, people decided, oh, this snake is actually Satan, right? He was messing with us all the way back then. We'll meet Satan in the book of Job too, but a very different kind of Satan than maybe the one you're used to. Because thou hast done this, cursed art thou from among all cattle and from among all beasts of the field. Upon thy belly shalt thou go, and dust shalt thou eat all the days of thy life. And I will put enmity, hatred between thee and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed. They shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise their heel. Right? You'll try to bite them, and they'll sort of smash your head. You'll always be fighting with each other. Then he punishes Eve with suffering in childbirth. And unto the woman he said, I will greatly multiply thy pain and thy travail. In pain thou shalt bring forth children, and thy desire shall be to thy husband, and he shall rule over thee. So the first punishment is pain and childbirth. The last punishment is that you have to do what your husband says. Gender hierarchy is part of the punishment of the fall, which suggests that there was no gender hierarchy in Eden, or at least not of the to the degree that we know that gender hierarchies came to dominate human culture. Um, Patriarchal societies, right? Um, this is interesting, right? Because that childbirth is so painful is like a really old anthropological problem across all human cultures, right? It it doesn't make sense because if you look at every other animal, childbirth is not painful for like a dog or a cow. I mean, I don't know, maybe a little bit. Uh, I don't think so though, right? Um, there's some most animals give birth without the suffering that human women experience. How to account for this? Well, an anthropologist can explain it, or a somebody who's an expert in human evolution could explain it to you, right? The reason why um, it seemed like there was an awkward edit there is because somehow um, I had to restart the recording. Anyway, the reason that the theology here gives for the women's pain in childbirth is that it's a punishment, right? It's a consequence of the sin that was committed, the original sin that was committed in Eden, of Eve's disobedience to God, and it kind of makes sense that needs explanation, though, right? Because humans seem to have particular suffering in childbirth that other animals don't have. And as I said, there's a scientific explanation for it. It has to do with the evolution of the human skull to accommodate our large brains compared to other primates, right? Which was not matched by a commensurate uh, widening of the birth canal. If you don't know anything about evolution, that's not going to make any sense. So you come up with this theological explanation for this inexplicable suffering, right? It's punishment. Then when it comes to Adam's punishment, right? Here we are. This one fascinates me, right? And unto Adam he said, because thou hast hearkened, listen, unto the voice of thy wife, and hast eaten of the tree of which I commanded thee, saying, thou shalt not eat of it, cursed is the ground for thy sake. In toil shalt thou eat of it all the days of thy life. Cursed is the ground. In Hebrew, arurah ha'adamah. Ha'adamah means ground. The same root as Adam, because he was made from the ground, right? What does that mean? The ground is cursed. Well, it has to do with the fact that, oh gosh, get out of here. There's my dog with his tube on because he has a medical condition. We have to stop him from biting his hindquarters. You're never gonna be able to concentrate with this idiot back here. Hello, Toby. Come on, get out. Get out. Oh. All right, I'm gonna say hi, and here he is. Yeah, you're a good boy. You're a good boy, but I'm doing my lecture. I'm doing my stories. All right? Okay, the lecture's not about dogs, so you have to go. No, don't lie down. Come on. Come on. Say bye-bye. Okay. So, cursed is the ground, right? In Eden, everything comes forth so easily, right? They have all the food they could possibly want, all the plants that grow and everything. God put that there for them. And there's no trouble about getting food or finding food or accessing, or making the ground blossom forth with delicious things or useful plants, etc. But in the real world, right, outside of Eden, domestication of plants, um, horticulture, agriculture, whatever you want to call it, is very difficult. Um, Thorns and thistle in toil shalt thou eat of it all the days of thy life. Right? It's gonna from now on. If you want to make a living, it's going to take hard, backbreaking work. Thorns and thistles shall it bring forth to thee, and thou shalt eat the herb of the field. In the sweat of thy face shalt thou eat bread, till thou return unto the ground. For out of it wast thou taken. For dust thou art, and unto dust thou shalt return. I love this. In the sweat, I always think about this line. In the sweat of thy brow, or thy face, shalt thou eat bread. And think about bread for a second. What we said about bread, the significance of bread in the Epic of Gilgamesh, right? Bread is a symbol of civilization, and it's one of the things that pulls Enkidu from the wilderness back into the world of people, right? That civilizes him. Bread, beer, women. And I pointed out in that Gilgamesh lecture that, of course, the domestication of cereal grains is the linchpin of all civilization, urban civilization. I mean, there are human societies that predate agriculture and the cultivation of grains, right? They're necessarily sort of limited in size and complexity, but they were very successful, right? It's only when you have something like a state that agriculture becomes a necessity. And the thing about it, though, right, although we associate agriculture with a sort of great leap forward in terms of the development of civilization, is that when it comes to the experience of the individual human being, agricultural subsistence is extremely difficult. It takes a lot of hard work and is actually much harder than hunter-gatherer life in terms of the amount of labor that goes into it. So to make a living as a cultivator of grains, right, in the sweat of thy brow shalt thou eat bread, feels like a punishment, right? Feels like something that is a curse. In the good old days before sin, we had Eden and everything grew so easily and God provided everything. Now we have to scratch out a living in the dust through agriculture. And there's almost a faint echo here, I always feel like, of a kind of deep memory of maybe a pre-agricultural way of living based on hunting and gathering that was probably for the individual people better than being part of some kind of agricultural quote-unquote civilization where you were sort of paying fealty to a state. There's a lot more I could say about that, about the curse that is agricultural subsistence. But fascinating. That's the thing that is the punishment at the forefront of the minds of the writers of the Yahwist text of Genesis, right? And then finally, right, you'll eat the bread, you'll scratch out a living from the ground until you return to the ground. For out of it wast thou taken, for dust thou art, and unto dust thou shalt thou return. Very famous line. Adam was made from the dust, from the dirt, and he will become dirt again, as will we all. And what I would just point out here about this, dust thou art, and to dust thou shalt return. Death here is very final, right? It is an ending. We think of the Bible as a text that is concerned with the nature of the soul and the disposition of one's soul at the moment of death, and heaven and hell and the afterlife and things like that. There is nothing like that here. When you die, you're done. You're dust. You come out of the dust and you return to the dust. And there is nothing else. At least in this text. I mean, there's, like I said, the Bible is not one text, and there are other parts of the Bible that are different in this respect. But the Hebrew Bible in particular is very silent on the idea of any kind of afterlife, right? And, that also connects back to Gilgamesh, the finality of death, right? His fear of mortality, right? There's not much in Gilgamesh either about the idea of any kind of soul that would outlast your body, and there's nothing here. There's no sense here at all given in the biblical text that there is anything that happens after death other than death, other than the end For out of it wast thou taken, for dust thou art, and to dust thou shalt return. There's no heaven waiting for Adam. There's no hell waiting for Adam either. It's just death. These conceptions about an eternal soul and the afterlife, those are mainly Christian. I don't know. They're at least much later ideas that they come to Judaism and then to Christianity, of course, where they're very important. But in these early Hebraic texts, these early Iron Age accounts of creation, nothing about the immortality of the soul or anything like that. I always found that interesting. Okay, so we'll stop there, and I gotta crack these two videos together somehow. But take a look at the Book of Job as the next reading, right in the next section, and signing off now. And we will I'll see you next lecture. Okay. Always remember you can email me too if you have any questions about anything. Thanks.